For being here and ask you to open your Bibles with me to John chapter 11. The book of John, the 11th chapter. This is going to be our text this morning. This first half of John's Gospel, chapters 1 through 12, is sometimes called the Book of Signs. And it's because John has deliberately selected 7 signs that he has arranged in a particular order in order that we would arrive at a specific conclusion. And he gives us that conclusion at the end of his book in chapter 20. He says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." So in other words, John did not give us a comprehensive picture of Jesus' ministry. There's many signs that were not recorded in the Gospel of John that we find in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and of course, even that were not recorded in those books. John tells us that if we were to record and if they were to write all of the acts which Jesus had done, all of the books within the entire world could not contain it. And so what we have in the book of John then are just a sampling of the miracles that Jesus performed. And what we're seeing in John's explanation here is that these were not just picked out of a hat at random. John did not just select these 7 signs because these were what appealed to him most, or because he just wanted to, he thought these were the coolest signs that Jesus worked. John was, of course, inspired, and he selected these because these signs are supposed to bring us to this conclusion that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so far what we have is about 6 signs that have been worked. First, Jesus turned water to wine at the wedding in Cana. And then after that, his second sign was the healing of a royal official's son. The third sign, Jesus healed a paralytic at the pool of Bethsaida. And then he fed 5,000 with scraps of food. He walked on water. And then he healed a man who had been born blind. And this brings us to the final sign, the 7th sign of John's Gospel, and that is the raising of Lazarus. That's the sign that we are going to be looking at this morning, is the raising of Lazarus. This is the ultimate evidence, the ultimate proof that John is giving us that Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Son of God. This miracle that Jesus performs here is unlike any other miracle that he had performed as of yet. Here was a man who was not sick but dead, and he had been dead for 4 days. 4 days is longer than Jesus himself had been dead, and yet this man who was dead against all odds and against every law of nature was raised. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through this text. We're going to look at the first 46 verses or 45 verses, and we're going to break it up into sections, little chunks of about 4. We're going to draw out a few lessons along the way, and then we're going to arrive at what is the ultimate point of this story. We'll save the best for last. But let's go ahead and begin reading in verse 1. We're going to read through verse 4. That's going to be our first section, verses 1 through 4 of John chapter 11. It says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" So this first section presents us with a dilemma. Lazarus, who was a longtime friend of Jesus, is ill. We don't know what he was sick with. The word that John uses here could really mean anything. He just simply means he was feeble, he was sick, he was not doing well. We don't know how long he had been sick. All we know is that it was very serious. To make matters worse, Jesus was not there. Jesus was actually quite a ways away from Bethany whenever Lazarus became ill. And so had Jesus been there, this would not be so much of a dilemma, because Jesus could heal pretty much anybody. At this point, he had proven that any disease whether it was blindness, whether it was paralysis, Jesus was capable of healing it. The sick, we read, were healed just by touching the fringes of his garment. However, in this case, there was no garment for Lazarus to touch. Jesus was far on the other side of the Jordan River. That is because the last time that he was in the region of Judea, which is where Bethany is at, Jesus had been persecuted very severely. The Jews there in chapter 10, the chapter prior to this, had attempted to stone him. And so he had to flee out of Judea to the opposite side of the Jordan River. And now at this time, he is at least a day's journey away, if not more, from Lazarus and his two sisters. So his sisters send him a message by a messenger, and they say to him, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And from this message, we gather the fact that Jesus was friends with Lazarus. This was not just a stranger to him. This is somebody whom Jesus knew intimately. The word that is used here for love is the Greek word phileo. This is the word that Jesus uses, or it's from the word that Jesus uses later in this chapter when he tells the disciples that our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. That's verse 11. So this was not a random stranger. This was a friend to Jesus. This was somebody he knew very well. And Mary and Martha, of course, we've read of them before as well. Luke tells us about them and Jesus going into their house and spending time with them, them showing him hospitality. So clearly this was a family that Jesus knew and knew very well. And they inform him that their brother, Lazarus, was ill. Notice they don't make any explicit request here. They don't ask him to come. They don't necessarily make any kind of demand of him. They simply inform him of the problem. They are women of faith, and I believe that they send this message to him hoping and believing that if Jesus would come, their brother would be saved. And that is something that I believe they knew very well, that Jesus was in fact able to heal their brother. So they send him this message. They let him know that their brother Lazarus was ill. But then Jesus reveals that this illness actually had a purpose. This illness was not going to end in death. He says this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, at first, it sounds like he's saying that Lazarus is not going to die. It sounds like if you were his disciple or you were one of Lazarus' sisters, you would think that by him saying this illness does not lead to death, that his illness would not be fatal. If a doctor had told you that some sickness you had was not going to lead to death, you would assume, well, I'm going to be okay. This isn't going to end in my death. However, we know that, strictly speaking, this illness did lead to death. Lazarus did die. And so what Jesus is saying here is not that death was not going to occur, but rather that death was not the end of this illness. It was not going to be the final word for Lazarus. There was a purpose, a plan that God had that transcended death. And Jesus tells us that purpose was God's glory and his own glory. It was going to be a means through which Jesus was going to be glorified as the Son of God. Now remember, John told us that these signs that he recorded, the signs that Jesus worked, were all intended for us to arrive at that conclusion, that Jesus was the Son of God. And so right away, we are being clued in to the fact that this illness that Lazarus has been afflicted with is actually going to culminate in the glory of Jesus as the Son of God. And so that's very good news so far. Now, that brings us to the first lesson that we can learn from this raising of Lazarus, and that is that human dilemmas are divine opportunities. This first point that we see here is that human dilemmas are divine opportunities. What may seem like a tragedy to us is, in fact, a golden opportunity for God, because it gives him the opportunity to manifest his power and to show us what he is capable of doing. There was a similar incident that was recorded in John chapter 9 where the disciples and Jesus come across a man who was born blind. And they asked him in John 9 verse 2, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" From their perspective, they thought that a tragedy of this sort, something that was this severe, could have only been the consequence of divine punishment. God must have been punishing this man or punishing this man on behalf of his parents. But Jesus corrects this, and he says in verse 3, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God may be displayed in him. He's showing them that our peril makes way for God's providence. Our own afflictions allow God to manifest himself in our lives and allow Jesus to work his power and show us who he truly is. Paul went through a very similar experience in 2 Corinthians 12:9 as he talks about his thorn in the flesh, and he prayed that it would be taken from him, and the Lord said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This is the first thing we're seeing in the story of Lazarus, is the power of God made perfect in weakness. And this is something that I think is hard to accept sometimes, that Jesus or that God is really most present, or we perceive him as being most present whenever we are struggling the most. And that is unfortunate, but it is the reality. There is a certain awareness of our dependence on him that really we can only have whenever we are suffering, whenever we have been afflicted with something. That just can't be replicated when the sun's shining and everything's going perfectly, as much as we may like that. There's a man by the name of Sir John Reith who said, "I do not like crises, but I like the opportunities which they supply." He's pointing out the fact that our hardships create opportunities for God to work his power. He's creating opportunities for us to depend on him and to grow with him. There's a song that I don't believe we've sung here before. If we have, I don't recall it, but I thought that the lyrics of this song go very well with this first point. It's titled, "God Moves in a Mysterious Way." The lyrics read, "God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower." Those lyrics, I think, they're a bit they're a little bit archaic. We don't speak this way anymore, but the message that is being conveyed here is timeless. It's this fact that God works most powerfully whenever we are going through what we may perceive to be a storm. These storm clouds that is referring to, it says, are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Had Lazarus not suffered, this great sign that Jesus worked would have never been performed. This great sign had to be preceded by tragedy, and so we must remember that when we are going through our own hardship, that God is sure to rescue us and that God is working behind the scenes. So that is the first point, is that human dilemmas are divine opportunities. Now, the stage has been set for Jesus to rush in and save the day. He has informed his disciples, and probably Mary and Martha, if he has sent word back with the messenger, that this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So things are looking up for Lazarus, and we are expecting that Jesus is going to jump up and go there right away. But that's not what happens. We read in the next few verses, it says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." This, I think, is the first surprise in this story, that Jesus stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was at. Why would he do that? If he had just found out that his friend was sick, that the illness was serious, that his friends Mary and Martha were, of course, grieving and worried and stressed about this, why would he not rush there immediately? Why is he waiting 2 days? Well, clearly this isn't an act of neglect. This was a deliberate decision on his part. It says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So," that word "so" is the Greek word "un," which means therefore or so. It's connecting what came before it to what comes after it. He's connecting the love that he had for them with his decision to stay 2 days longer in the place where he was. So what seems at first like an act of neglect is really an act of love. Jesus was making this decision because of his love for them. But in order for us to understand why he chose to do this, we have to keep reading. So keep reading with me as we go, starting in verse 7. It says, "Then after this, he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus said, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So here we find the reason why Jesus chose to wait. He says in verses 14 through 15, For your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. In other words, by waiting, by delaying his arrival, Jesus was able to strengthen the faith of his disciples. Not only his disciples who were with him here on the other side of the Jordan, but of course Mary and Martha also, and everybody who was present for this sign. Jesus was not making this decision because he was too busy for them. He did not choose to delay simply because he did not care. In fact, he chose to do this because he was very concerned about their spiritual well-being. The longer he delayed, the more powerful this act would be. The more powerful this miracle would appear, and the more they would believe in him. The stronger their faith would be. And so this brings us to the second lesson that we learn from this account. And that is that the Lord's lingering is an act of love. When the Lord lingers, it is because he loves us. Think about how long those 4 days must have felt for Mary and Martha as they waited and waited and waited. 4 days is not a long time in normal circumstances, but whenever your loved one's life is on the line, whenever you are suffering very severely, 4 days is a long time to wait. And I can only imagine that they were looking down the road constantly waiting to see Jesus coming down that road, coming to heal their brother, coming to save them from their peril, and yet he was not there. This is, I think, what the psalmist is expressing in Psalm 13, 1 through 2. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? There are times where it seems as though God is either unaware of our distress, or it seems as though he simply does not care. It seems as though he is delaying his comfort for some reason or another. And it is here that we learn that the reason is because he loves us. It is because through his delay, he is strengthening our faith. He is teaching us to depend on him. He is teaching us to wait on him. The Lord's delay is not a disregard for our distress. It is a means of stirring our faith. And so when the Lord delays, we must learn to wait. In Lamentations 3, verses 25 through 26, it reads, The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. So the Lord's lingering is an act of love. It's a means of strengthening our faith and teaching us to wait on him. And we must simply learn to do it, and to do it patiently. And so this brings us now to the third section of this account, verses 17 all the way into verse 37. So in these verses, we're going to see the reaction of several people as they react to this tragedy, as they react not only to the death of Lazarus, but also to the delay of Jesus. So let us return to the text, and starting in verse 17, it says, Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it to you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." And when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here, and he is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Now here we have a series of reactions, and the first reaction we have is Martha's. Martha here is true to character. We see that Martha, it seems, out of the two sisters, is the one who prefers action. She's always moving. In Luke's account, she's the one who's busy with much serving, while Mary is quietly seated at the Lord's feet. And here again, Mary is remaining in the house because that was the custom of their day. For about a week after a loved one had passed away, they would remain in their house. They would remain in sort of a secluded state. There would be people who came to see them and to comfort them, but the family of the deceased would stay in the house. And so Mary is abiding by that custom, staying in her house, whereas Martha jumps up as soon as she hears that Jesus is approaching the village, and she goes to see him first. And what we see with Martha is this sort of tension between a doubt and grief and hope. She is still clinging to hope in the midst of her grief. She says to him in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And there's here at least an element of disappointment with him for not being there. She's saying, if you had been here, this could have been prevented. This didn't have to happen. She knew that Jesus was very well able to heal her brother of this illness, whatever this illness was, and yet he had not made it there in time. And so first she is expressing this despair, this disappointment that Jesus had failed to prevent this from occurring. But then in verse 22, we see her faith emerge. She says, "But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." I really relate to Martha's reaction here because I think it's a very realistic Christian's experience, because she is still clinging to her faith, but she is still battling with doubt and with sorrow and with grief. She is clearly not. She doesn't have a perfect faith here. She doesn't necessarily believe everything that she is saying. She says, "I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." And I don't think she actually believed that Jesus could heal her brother, at least that he would heal her brother. Jesus tells her that her brother will rise again, and she assumes he's talking about the resurrection. And later, whenever Jesus will tell them to remove the stone from the tomb, Martha is the one who speaks up and protests. And so Martha, of course, her faith is not perfect here, but she is still clinging to it. And I think she is to be commended for that. Martha is, in spite of her doubt, in spite of her grief, she is still holding on to this fundamental faith that she has, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And though she does not fully understand the implications of that, though she does not fully understand everything that this means, she is still clinging to these convictions. And so in Martha, we see a woman who is hurt, but she is yet hopeful. And then we get to Mary's reaction. Mary's reaction is much the same as Martha's in the sense that her verbiage, what she says to him, is verbatim. It is identical. It says, "Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" So the difference between Mary and Martha is not in their words, because really the essence of what they're saying is the exact same. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. So Mary too is disappointed. Mary too is deeply grieving this loss. The difference, though, between Martha and Mary is in their posture. As far as we can tell, Martha remains upright as she speaks with the Lord, whereas Mary immediately throws herself at his feet. And I think that this is just interesting when we remember Luke's account and what she was doing there. Luke tells us that as Martha was busy with much serving, Mary was sitting at his feet, listening to his teaching. Here again, we see her in the exact same place. She is under very different circumstances now. She is grieving, she is hurting, she is very, very discouraged, and yet she is still throwing herself at the Master's feet. She is still expressing this utter dependence and reliance upon him. And so in Mary, we are seeing, not just through her words, but through her action, how much she still trusts in Jesus. These women were confused, but they still clung to their faith, and they are to be commended for that. But the most, I think, remarkable reaction is not the reaction of Martha. It is not the reaction of Mary. It is the reaction of Jesus. In this account, we are seeing a side of him that we do not often see if we have seen it anywhere else. We read in verses 33 through 34 that when Jesus saw her, that is Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. These words that John uses are a little bit, they're a little bit confusing. They're not confusing in the sense that they're hard to understand. They're a little bit confusing because of what they usually convey. These words for deeply moved and greatly troubled typically convey a sense of agitation and indignation, as if he were angry about something. And so the question is asked, well, what is he angry about? Certainly he's not angry that they are grieving the loss of their brother, because Jesus in a matter of moments will grieve with them. And so what is he angry about? Well, some have suggested that this anger was righteous indignation, that Jesus was looking at the ultimate consequences of sin, which is death, and the grief that had followed that death. And his anger, his indignation here was because of sin and because of the suffering that resulted as a result, or that resulted on account of it. Now, I don't know whether or not that is true, and John certainly doesn't tell us. But what John does tell us in verse 35 is that Jesus wept. I think this is the most important thing here. I think that whether or not Jesus felt any tinge of agitation or indignation at the cause of this death, what is certain is that Jesus wept. The Son of God, the Christ, wept. I think that what Jesus is showing us here is not despair, but sympathy. Jesus, in a matter of moments, is going to heal this man. He's going to raise this man for whom they are weeping. And his weeping then is not an act of despair or probably even grief, the way that Mary and the Jews were grieving over Lazarus, but rather an act of sympathy. Jesus is weeping with those who weep. And that brings us to our third lesson from this account. Jesus shares in our sorrows. This text shows us that the Lord shares in our sorrows. The psalmist writes in Psalm 34:18 that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. And it is through this account that we see just how near he really is, not just in proximity, but in sympathy. He is near not just in the sense that he is close by, he's near in the sense that he understands. He is near to that feeling. He has felt that feeling, and he feels it with you. That is what the Hebrew writer is saying in Hebrews 4:15, when he says that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus is able to sympathize, to feel with our grief, to feel with our sorrows in a way that we can hardly fathom. This is, I think, one of the most remarkable lessons from this text, this short verse here in verse 35. Jesus wept. We are seeing that the man of sorrows is indeed deeply acquainted with grief, as Isaiah says. And in a matter of moments, we're going to see his divinity as he raises a man from the dead. But here we see his humanity as he weeps with those who weep. There's a preacher by the name of G. Campbell Morgan. He said, Jesus weeping is a revelation of God's sympathy, so quick, so sensitive. In a little while, he will wipe all tears away. But while they are there, even though he will dry them, and in the sorrow, he enters into fellowship with that sorrow. And so remember this as you are going through sorrows of your own, that the Lord shares in those sorrows, that He is near to the brokenhearted, and that He is very much able to sympathize. Now this brings us to the ultimate moment of this text, the moment that the entire story has been building towards, the sign itself in verses 38 through 44. So we're going to conclude with this final section here, starting in verse 38. It says, "Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days.' Jesus said to her, 'Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?' So they took away the stone. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me.' When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to him, 'Unbind him and let him go.'" And there we have the final sign of John's gospel, the seventh of the 7 signs, in which we see that Jesus truly can do anything. This man who had been dead for 4 days, he raised as though he had never died. We have records of Jesus raising other people from the dead, at least 2 others, the son of the widow of Nain and I believe Jairus' daughter. But in both of those instances, they were raised within moments of their dying, or at least on the same day that they had died. This was made all the more remarkable by the fact that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. There was a rabbinical tradition that the soul of the deceased would hover above the body for about 4 days, 3 to 4 days after they had died. And once the 4th day had set in, the body had begun to noticeably decompose, the soul departed. And of course, that scripture nowhere teaches that, but it's very possible that the Jews of the Lord's day were deceived by that belief. And so by waiting 4 days, he was able to demonstrate in the most compelling way possible that he had the power over life and death, that he could raise the dead. And the result of this sign was mixed, as always. Every time that Jesus performed a sign in John's gospel, it resulted in 2 things. It resulted in controversy and it resulted in faith. It says that the Jews in verse 46 went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." And what follows after this is the ultimate conspiracy to put Jesus to death. This was the final sign of John's gospel. It may not have been the final miracle he ever performed, but after this point, John's gospel transitions into the final week of his life. And from this point forward, Jesus is on the fast track to his death. And so by raising his friend from the dead, Jesus was in essence laying his own life down. His friends had told him before he went into Judea that the Jews were going to attempt to kill him. He said, "The last time we were there, they tried to stone you." And Jesus knew the consequences, and yet he went anyways. He truly loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. But of course, in spite of this controversy and in spite of the negative results, the result that God intended for this sign to have were fulfilled. It says in verse 45 that many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. That was the whole point. That was what this was all working towards, was to furnish this ample evidence for his disciples, for those who did not yet believe in him, so that they would know without a doubt that this was truly the Christ, the Son of God. And so this was the result of this great sign. It was controversy, but it was also a great conversion that took place afterwards. But this brings us to the 4th point and the final lesson from this text. That is the meaning behind the sign. See, every sign that John records had some sort of meaning behind it. It was not just a random act of power. These were signs that signified something about Jesus. They were things that demonstrated some grand fact about him. And so he would either before the sign or after the sign, he would teach some lesson about himself, and that sign would be the affirmation or the testament to that fact. So for example, whenever he had fed the 5,000 with a few scraps of bread, he told them afterwards in John 6:35, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." That is what the feeding of the 5,000 showed them, was that he was truly the bread of life, that he was the source of all spiritual sustenance. And by feeding the 5,000, he proved it. He showed them that he truly was the bread of life. And so there was a sign, and then there was a meaning behind the sign. The same was true whenever he healed the man who was born blind. Before he healed the man, he said, "I am the light of the world." He gave enlightenment to this man, not just in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. And that is what Jesus was demonstrating by this sign. And so the sign that we have now, this raising of Lazarus, was not just a random act of power. It was not just to flex his ability to do whatever he wanted to do. It was to demonstrate what he had said prior in verses 25 through 26, when he told Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." This is the fourth and the final lesson from this sign, that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. This is really the so what of this sign. It's the ultimate message that is being conveyed. And there are two, I guess you could break this up into two parts. There is a present significance, so what this means for us right now, today, and then there is a future significance, what this means for us in the time to come. The present significance of this sign is that Jesus Christ is the source of spiritual life. In the same way that death separates the soul from the body, sin separates us from God. That is why Isaiah says in Isaiah 59:2, "Your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God." And so whenever we have committed sin, we have in essence died. We are physically alive, but spiritually we are dead. We are separated from God. But Jesus, by raising Lazarus from a physical death, proved to us that he has the ability to raise us from our spiritual death and to reunite us with God. And that is what we see all throughout the New Testament. Paul said in Ephesians 2:3-6, that God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ and raised us up with him. He said a similar thing to the Colossians in Colossians chapter 2. He said, "And you who were dead in your trespasses, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses." And again in Romans chapter 6, he says, "We were buried therefore with him by baptism into death, in order that we too might walk in newness of life." This is the present significance of this sign. Jesus is showing us that he offers us newness of life right now, today. Jesus can raise us not just from a physical death, but from a spiritual death. And he can give us this newness of life with God through him, in which we can die to sin and be alive to God through Christ. No matter how long you've been dead in your sins, whether it be 4 days, 4 years, or 40 years, Jesus has the power to raise you from that death and to revive you, to give you a new life, to give you a brand new way of living. But then this brings us to the future significance, and this is equally important. In John chapter 5, Jesus said, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment." The future significance of this sign is that you will rise too. Each and every one of us will be raised from the dead. Jesus will call us forth with his voice, and we will be raised either to the resurrection of life, or we will be raised to the resurrection of judgment. The question is not if you will come out of the tomb, but rather what you will come out to. whether the voice you hear will be the voice of a friend or the voice of a judge, whether you come out to life eternal or to an everlasting death. The choice is yours, and Jesus is offering you the opportunity to be raised from your spiritual death and to soon, when he returns, be raised from a physical death. This concludes our study. I hope that this was helpful to you, and I hope that you've been able to take away some lessons from this great sign from John chapter 11. In a few moments, we're going to be singing an invitation song, and at this time, we want to extend an invitation to anybody who has not yet obeyed the gospel to do so this morning. You have the opportunity this morning to come believing in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, to confess that belief, to repent of your sins, and to be baptized for the remission of those sins. If you desire to do that, we ask that you would come forward at this time as we stand and sing the invitation.